Okay, good morning. Sorry it took me a bit to get my computer straightened out. My name is Samantha Mirabal. I'm with Melco's application team, and we're doing our Design Shop Talk again today. See what questions you might have and get them answered. And sorry, that's going to bother me. So I did type up a little overview of kind of what questions were asked ahead of time. So these are kind of the topics we're going to be going over for sure. And if you have questions as we're going, feel free to type them in on the comments. Don't send them privately to Melco. I don't see those until long after. So if you want it live at the time, please type them in on the feeds. If you see me looking off to the side, I'm looking for what questions have been asked. So kind of can keep track of the feeds over there. All right, so for some reason Facebook did not want to show me the comments, which I can see them now. Weird. All right, so topics ahead of time. We had some questions about the Accelerator hotkeys, so I'll go over those. There's a question on how to customize our tool palettes. Someone said they're having a little problem with the monogram and the primer stitch that goes underneath it, so we'll cover that. We've got alphabet editor. I did post a link where this question was asked on a video we have, and we'll get that video in the comments as well, where Scott went into a lot of detail about the editor itself, so you can take a look at that and see if that helps. The auto split feature, I'll show you auto split, and then I'll give you another idea as well for those. Did have some questions on making outlines, on fonts, how to work with two color fonts. So quite a few of how to work with fonts, and kind of all of these, 5, 6, and 7. I'll show some other examples that are kind of fun. And then we'll kind of talk about some how to make clean text. I know a lot of people saw a picture I posted yesterday. I don't know, the day before, on some tiny text that I was playing with. So we'll go over that. All right, so first and foremost, we had a question, is there a shortcut to the printable list? So first off, if you're unfamiliar with what those accelerator keys are, if you look at Design Shop, right, and all these little menus that pop down, you'll see that sometimes we've got, keyboard keys on what you can do for that. So if I want to do a decorative stitch, I can do Control Shift and hit the number 4, and that will take me there, and that will save me from having to go, walk decorative. It will get me there without having to do a bunch of mouse movements. So working with all right, Mike, that's funny. Sorry, Mike said, make sure to rub it in with all the small text. Haha, yes. Anyway, so the accelerator keys, the ones that are built into the software, you can find over here. So while you're learning them, and one of the things you'll find when you're digitizing, doing keyboard shortcuts does speed up your process, okay, rather than moving your mouse around. I will say I have forcibly, because I do these lives and I teach, no one can see me hit the keyboard, and then I get fussed at over that. So I have gotten away from using hotkeys personally, because I'll do them by default, and then everyone's like, wait, what'd you do? What'd you do? So, but you can also create your own. So here under Tools, Accelerator Editor, you can create your own. So like if you always align right, you can go type in your own key, assign that, whether, it's Control, Alternate, Shift, whatever you want, and a number or a function key, whatever, and you can type that in, assign it, and now that will be yours. Now Scott did post a link on both the Facebook and YouTube feeds that will take you to a discussion about the accelerators, and it does have a PDF sheet and how to assign them, so you do have that available for you. All right, where you can print them out, set them up, and then they're good to go. All right, so what other questions? Are the tool palettes customizable? So kind of. So the tool palettes that you see here, if you go to any of these separators and right click, you can go customize, and you can take things off of your list, but you can't really move them around. Now you can move them around the screen. So let's say you don't want this docked on the left, you want it docked up top. Okay, so I can put that up top and have it up here. I don't want it there. I want it back here. So I'm going to put it back. So you can dock it around. You can leave it floating. Although if you close it, then you got to go turn it back on. So I like leaving them all docked. And I just leave the default, but you can move them around. So again, if you want to remove things, so you can go right click on the separator, customize, and let's say you want to get rid of, or you want to take that off. So you can remove that, and now it's gone from the list. If you want to add it back, you can put it back, things like that. Okay. So yes, the palettes are customizable. The next part of that question was, is there a favorite feature that you like of DesignShop that other softwares might not have? A few things, I like a lot of it, but right here, the design checker is really cool. So I use that quite a bit. I'm fairly certain unique to DesignShop only, but you can come over to your design checker or come over here, and it will, for anything that's wireframe, it'll tell you things to be careful of. It'll tell you if you don't have your tie-in and tie-outs, if you don't have underlay, if your density is too tight, if your needle penetrations are too close so that you're going to be tearing up the fabric. It'll check the wireframe stuff and give you feedback on things that should change. Like here, I've got columns under 10 points. If I'm going to do that as a 60 weight thread or with a 65/9 needle, that might be all right, but that's something I should at least go assess before I just go, hey, just go for it. Okay. So design checker, what else? It's right here. Yeah, that's probably what I like the most. Lettering comp is also unique. Lettering comp's really cool. It'll do compensation based on the letter, so it knows what direction it's sewing, and it'll automatically compensate for you. So that's pretty cool, particularly with the TrueType fonts. We have a question that was typed in on Facebook on YouTube. I have my screens backwards. Is there an option where you can set the machine to sew faster on some patterns than others in the same design? Absolutely. So I don't have my machines hooked up to here, but let's see. When you're setting up the colors on the right hand side of the screen, you can go on to settings by color. All right, so there it is. So you would turn on settings by color, and then you can set up that for each color that you're going to sew. You can set up the speed, the active feeds settings. You can change trim types. There's a lot of features in there that you can do. So that's what you want to look for when you're setting up colors. There's a tab up the top that says enable settings by color or something like that. So you enable that, and then you can go through and for every color set up different speeds, different whatever you're trying to work with. I think you can actually do that here too within DesignShop, kind of. Oh, good grief. It's been a while since I've done that. Where is it? Of course, now that I want to find it, it's going to be MIA. I always do it in... all right, I should quit looking for it, because I always do it within the OS itself. Nope, it's not here. All right, I don't remember where it is. It's under project somewhere. Project? Melco OS. Haha. The screen looks similar to this when you're setting up color settings by color. So, tools, Melco OS settings. So within Melco. There we go. Scott just pointed me since I'm sitting here staring at the screen. Yeah. So settings by color, you turn those on, and then for each color, you can go and decide what it is. This works very similar on the OS side, and that's where I usually do it, but the screen looks just about the same. Colors up top, but that's about all that's different. And you can, again, for color 7, change your speeds, change your active feed settings, change everything. All right, so there we go. Someone said they're still trying to locate the design checker. Design checker is in the new version of DesignShop. It's over here on the right hand side, so you can get to it a few ways. You've got this toggle design checker, or down at the bottom you got project, stitches, navigator, design checker. So this will just toggle between them, whereas if you do it here, it kind of adds it as a floating screen up there. So that's where you'll find the design checker. Okay. So now that I stumbled and you guys got to watch me fumble around, let's get back to stuff. I'm struggling with monograms, that stitching and the stitching that flattens. So kind of, I think what you're asking about is the primer stitch. So you couldn't see what buttons were being pushed. All right. So let's look at how to do that. So I've got a monogram here, and I'm going to zoom in on it so we're not looking at the rest of my stuff. All right. So we do have a link that we're going to give you. Brian, the settings by color, it can be either way. It can be by needle or by color, but yeah, it's you can set it up either way. I think I'd have to go to my computer. I should turn them on. All right, so view, object, generate basting primer stitch. Okay, so if I do that, I can come here and instead of basting, change it to primer. And you can accept the default if you want, and it will create that. If you want this to be closer, what would you do different? Okay, so 50, that's how many points away from this that it's generating it. So if instead of 50, I go, again, object, generate primer. The other way you can get to that screen is to select what you want to create the primer stitch around. Right click, operations, generate basting primer stitch. Okay, change that to primer. Let's say you want that to be 30 instead of 50. Say OK. And notice it's closer than it was before. And remember, this is really nice when you're working with napped fabrics. You know, if you've got fur that's going to come up and eat it, or something that moves a lot and you want to hold it still. It's good to sew it in the color that you're sewing on. So if you're sewing on a white towel, sew with white thread. It makes it less obtrusive, so you don't notice it as much, and you're more focused on the actual design rather than the understitching. Okay, so that I think was what you're asking. You didn't know how to get to that stitch, so it's right click, operations, basting primer. Okay, we'll get Scott to put the video up there for you as well on the primer stitch. Let's see, what else do we have? All right, so Brian, I noticed you're here, so I'll go over all right, I'll do Brian, yours next. We have a follow-up on the primer. How can you thicken the primer? So when you say thicken the primer, this is asked on Facebook, do you mean make the stitches closer together under there, or to make it wider around the shape? So if you want to make the lines, so the squares smaller, so each of these lines closer together. Okay, so to do that, I would just edit it. Well, let's do them one at a time. Actually, let's just do it again. I'll show you from scratch. So object, generate primer, change it to primer stitch, change it to 30, and density. That's how close those lines are together. All right, the larger the number, the larger those boxes are going to turn out to be. The smaller the number, the closer they're going to be. So let's say we want that to be 20, a density of 20. Notice now I've got a more dense crosshatch pattern going. Okay, now you can always modify these later. So rather than redoing it like I just did there, I can select these elements, and let's change that the density to 15. Again, it's more dense. Or if I go, I really don't need that much, let's change it to 40. Okay, so you can do it either way. You can recreate the primer stitch, or you can just go ahead and modify these directly. Okay, so the default is 30. So you can move it around to whatever you want. All right, so that was the follow-up there. So let's bounce back to we have a lot of questions on lettering. So one was specifically about this auto split thing. So I have two different examples here. So what I did was I'm going to create them from scratch so you can see it. So I'm going to create a letter S, change that to century because I want to make it bigger. All right, so when you do that, notice it does this weird, satin, it goes to a fill stitch and then back to satin. It's not the cleanest look if you just leave it as that. And that's because we're using the font larger than it's intended to be used, right? So if I right click on that and go to the properties, what are different things we can do? All right. Well, first and foremost, just so people always ask me, why is it doing this? Well, first off, let's understand that. Right here, this number. That's what's saying how long the stitch gets before it switches over to fill. So that means from one side of the element to the next. Once that distance is bigger than this number, which is 80 points, it's going to switch to fill. All right, so what can we do about avoiding that? Well, I can come down to presets and I can say auto split. I like auto split a lot. I use it a lot. It kind of gives you a cleaner look through there. Now, other things you can do. So let's look at this. If I leave it as fill standard, change this to 6. This one, you just got to write down the formula. 501, 501. And hit apply. That will do a auto split down roughly the center. And it's really pretty. Okay, so that's using a 6 partition with a 501, repeat, 501, 501. Okay, and the stitch angle of 90. So that will give you there. So it's just a different look. Is one wrong or not? No, it's just different, right? So this is just using a standard auto split. That one is kind of customizing your own by making sure it's set to a fill of standard, 6, and then a 501. Okay. So that's what I would do for those. And it gives it a nicer look, I think, anyway. Okay. Okay, is it possible to do an outline border of a font that's typically a satin or fill stitch? Absolutely. So back to my one example. I did a bunch before class, can you tell? All right, so I typed out some text. All right, that's just plain old lettering, block 2, at a 1-inch height. All right, so that's all that is. A quick look and see if I'm missing any comments. Nope. All right. So I've got some text. I went ahead and kerned it out a little bit more, knowing I was going to put borders on these. So I did the auto kerning at 15. And then I said, all right, that's good enough. That's a satin font. Now, how would I create these other things? Okay, well, let's do that. So if I select it, you can either go right click, operations, change element type. That's one way. Or you can select it, and right here, this icon is the same change element. All right, so the only difference is you have to know the hotkeys if you're doing it with, shift control. Here you can stop and think about it. So if I take my lettering and I go, all right, I want to add a single line center, which is a constant width column. So these are single line centers down here. And I say, okay, I want to add. I don't want to get rid of my base art. I just want to add it. Okay, so now I have this and I can delete the other text. I can move this around. I have now an outline version of that same name. Okay, the same way, if I want it to be a bean stitch, like this guy down here, what would I do? So again, you can always use the change element type button, or I like the trick of, it's just a hotkey. I hold the shift key down. So on my keyboard, I'm holding shift, and now I'm going to click on the walk. And then I'm going to move that up and change it to a bean stitch. Okay, so now I have a bean stitch version of my text. Okay, that's cool. Well, what if I want chain stitch or maybe a decorative fill or something else? All right, what can we do? So again, take the same text. I'm going to do shift. What was next? Oh, the chain stitch. All right, so shift, click on the walk. Now I'm going to change it to decorative. And all right, it defaults to whatever decorative is there. That one, not good. Let's change it to chain stitch. Again, that chain stitch is huge, so let's make it smaller. There. Now I have kind of a chain stitch look. And I can play with those parameters within. So I did that quick. How did I get there? I went to properties and then I played with these. So you can try different things. Let's leave that longer. And let's make this one 30. I don't know. You can play with them until it gets a look that you like. Okay. All right. So we have chain stitch. Well, what if we want to do a fill, a decorative fill? I like decorative fills. So I'm going to hold the shift, make it a complex fill, move it up, and I'm just going to change the stitch type to decorative. And then you can play with the, oops, 3D. Then you can change the different patterns to whatever you want it to be. Okay, so you can play with different patterns. So there's a lot of flexibility in what you can do. And all that is just taking basic lettering. I mean, it's block 2, some text, and then playing with it. Okay. So a follow-on question we had was, well, how do I deal with these 2-color fonts? All right, so I'm going to do this one from scratch so you can see how it turns out. All right, so if I type my name, I just type it. I'm going to change this to the 2-color block. Okay, so I have a 2-color block, and you see it's got a bunch of colors. And it's not exactly the easiest to go change them if you're dealing with it over here. So I usually like to do this. Whatever my outline color is, I just select the lettering as a whole and choose that to change the outline color. For the center, rather than going through and individually changing each of those colors, over here on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see we've got these are the colors that are in the design. So I know it's that one. So I can right-click, edit color, and I can go change that to whatever I want. Let's pick a blue, apply, and it will change them all at once. Okay, so that can kind of save you work and make it go really quick. So you can do that over here as well for even the outlines if you want. You could just right click on it, change the outline color, and it will do it all at once. Okay. So we wrote my name a lot. All right, what else do we have? That's the easy way to do those. We covered that. All right, so back to the top of this one. How to successfully save a new font using the alphabet editor in version 11. So when you are working in the alphabet editor, Scott did a really nice video on that, but the kind of tricks you can use would be to, first and foremost, digitize your whole alphabet in one file. That way you can make sure it's consistent across that. They're all the same sizes, design it as a 1-inch font, those sorts of things. And once you're done, then you go create it in the alphabet editor and just create each character that you digitized and load it over. So spam is calling me. That's nice. All right, so here, tools, alphabet editor. It'll bring it up. You can create new. I have this test one. So you literally would just say, all right, new. What letter are you going to do? You would type in your key. So I'm going to do a capital E, say OK. And now you would, go to your file that you have, paste it over here, and it automatically saves it. So when you're doing work within the editor, it's automatically saving it as you're creating it. All right. Once you're all done, you have your OFA. So right now, these are all empty because this is just a test one that I keep on pulling up. But assuming you had actually put letters in here, then right now, this particular font, my test font, only has A, B, C, E, and a lowercase d. Okay, so I clearly have a lot of work to do, plus actually adding the files. But it's literally that basic. You would go create your font and just put file at a time in here, make sure they're wireframe, make sure they're well digitized, that you thought about the pathing and those sorts of things, because it's a little bit obnoxious when you have trims mid-letter. So those are the kinds of things you just want to consider as you're doing the digitizing for your font. But once it's all done, it's just a matter of chunking them in here for each character that you did, and then you have a keyboard typable font. Okay. What else? how do we import DST designs and fonts to stitch nicely without editing? Well, the DST has to be good. I mean, that's kind of the bottom line. You can go through and, like, when I buy, I don't do this anymore, but things I've bought, fonts, where are my fonts? Fonts. So, I don't know. These are all fonts I've bought at one time or another. And they're all DSTs. So when you buy them as DSTs, you get a gazillion files, and they're just individual letters. So you literally would bring them in one at a time. And there. Okay, so if I would just select my color, copy, go to the other one, paste it in, move them around, line them up, and that sort of thing. Okay, so when you buy the DST fonts, that's kind of what you're going to end up doing, is bringing in one letter at a time, positioning it where you want it, and going from there. Assuming they're digitized well, they'll stitch well. If they're not digitized so hot, then you might have issues with them stitching. And remember, when you're working with expanded stitch types, there's no wireframe, there's no smart information in there. So if you're scaling them, you're going to be changing however it was digitized. Okay, and it's going to make the stitches go closer together. If you go real small, what does that do? That makes them really dense, right? So you're going to be making something potentially bulletproof. You scale it out, now you're taking stitches that should be close together and you're spreading them out, all right? It's not going to look as clean. So when you're working with your expanded file types, it's really better not to scale them around. And if you're going to scale to, limit yourself to no more than plus or minus 20%, I'll say I try to stick closer to 10%, 10 to 15. But that's a personal preference. So just keep that in mind because it does change them when you edit expanded files in that manner. Okay. Any questions typed in? Nope. All right. Could you do a video that shows what you do to a file that someone else digitized? Sometimes files will stitch great. Other times you need to tweak them. Yeah, I guess we could. Typically, I'll just give you kind of highlights of what I look for. So when I go to a file that someone else did, do I have any? Here, let's open up this guy. Sorry, David. David did this one. So things I look for. Do they have knots? So does it mean does it have tie-in and tie-outs? If there's no tie-in and tie-outs, I better fix that, right? So I make sure we have tie-in and tie-outs because the tie-in is what you want when the machine starts. The tie-off is what your clients want, so things don't wash out. Make sure there's underlay. Nothing, I think personally, I think everything should have underlay of some sort, even if it's just a center walk, because that's going to secure your fabric to the stabilizer and make sure you have a nice foundation for your top stitching to go in so it's not moving around as much. So I look for tie-in and tie-outs. I tend to run the design checker to see if we have super tiny stitches, and if so, I at least assess them to whether they make sense or not. This particular design is meant for 60 weight thread, and a smaller needle, so smaller columns are fine, but you got to think about that sort of thing. So I look for those. Down here, this particular text is really tiny. You can see it's only 0.11 tall, and this little E is even smaller than that. It's itty bitty. So on those, I tend to look at pull compensation for small things, and then the underlay. So when I go into the properties, I'll go, all right, for underlay, what do we have? This was the first thing I actually changed. I went, a 20-point walk on something this small is not going to be the best idea. So change that to something smaller. So changing that, making sure you have just a center walk, nothing else is really going to fit under there. Making sure we have some compensation. But then on this E, the other thing I look at is, all right, that doesn't really look like an E, does it? It looks more like a dot. So here, go into the wireframe editing and open some of this up so that we actually have Stop it. So we actually have some space and gap in here. Okay. So, and also with the connectors. But, you know, that's just the stuff I look for, is trying to open it up. Here, when it's stitched out, you know, I just look at it and go, knowing this is going to be small, it's going to look like all one thing. So kerning will be another thing to address on this one. You can either do it manually or spread it out a little bit more so that, you know, you got a little bit more space between these, so it will sew out cleanly. Okay. So those are kind of the main things I look for, is tiny stitches, your tie-in and tie-outs, and underlay. I generally don't mess with what densities people select, because I like one thing, the next digitizer likes another. When we digitize, generally it sews out pretty decent regardless. So it's just a personal preference. So I usually just leave it be and see how it sews. The other thing, just with this particular file, I went, well, these are nearly line to line. I don't like that. I like a little more overlap on them. So I try to get 2 or 3 stitches. So those are, you know, now I'd go save this and run it and see what it did. Okay. We can always, when we sew it out, other things to consider with tiny text is like all these connectors, right? What are you going to do with them? Do we want to sink the stitch in between it? What does that actually mean? That means rather than just doing a connector where you're going from one to the next, it's going to do a midway needle penetration. That buries that connector stitch, so it's harder to see and you won't notice it. So that's, you know, once you sew this out, if you still aren't happy with how the connectors are, you can always come in here and do some expanded point editing where you add a stitch along there, you know, add a manual stitch to force that needle penetration in the way. So you can do things like that. Yeah, so those are what I look for. I'm not sure if that was helpful for you, but mainly tie-in and tie-outs, column width and size, making sure I don't have a huge density of needle penetrations in one spot. We talked about the 2-color font, so we did that one. Pull compensation of you want to know, that's the next question. I love help with pull compensation. Explanation of what it does to a design would help. All right, so let's look at that. We'll come back to this in a second. All right, new. So pull compensation, you know, just drawing a shape. Okay, so now I've got something to play with. Let's change the stitch direction on that. There. All right. So pull compensation, what that's going to do is it compensates for the fact that embroidery shrink is going to narrow up and stretch out depending on which direction you're sewing, right? So if I'm just doing a straight column, so if I've got a single line center, I'm going to make it wider so we can actually see it. Okay, so if I have a single line center, so it's just a column stitches, right? They're all the same size going from one side to the other. I've told it to be 40 points wide. When it sews, if I were actually to get technical and go measure it out, it's going to be smaller than 40 points, most likely. And why is that? Well, that's going to be your pull effect. It's each side is going to try to move in just a little bit. And there's, you know, as embroiderers, we try to prevent that and to minimize those effects. But, you know, it makes sense to me why it happens, because when we start sewing, our machine's going to go make a needle penetration here. And then it's going to drag itself over here, make another needle penetration. What's happening? Here, my top thread is already in that hole, and it's pulling. As my machine's moving this way, that hole that the thread's going through is pulling this way until it makes the next stitch. All right, now it makes a stitch, and it's moving this way. So what's happening to the hole that was just made with now another piece of thread in it? It's going to try to slide this way. So all of these stitches on this side are trying to move to the left. All of these stitches are trying to move to the right. All right, so it's trying to shrink. All right, so how do we prevent that? We use good stabilizer, we hoop well. So those are the practical things that we do to make sure stuff holds still. Once we're sure it's holding still, now we have to digitize for that. So make sure we have good underlay. Again, that's all towards making it hold still and giving it a nice foundation to sew on. And then you have pull compensation. So if I go into the properties and I go to compensation. I like offset. I'll be frank, I never use percentage. Percentage is going to be multiplication based. This is just a straight offset. How far do you want it to overstitch? Right now, it's set to 0, which means it's going to sew exactly on the wireframe line. Whereas I'm going to make this really big. Don't do this. You don't need 10 points of offset. I'm just doing this to show you what it's doing. Notice now, 10-point offset, it's overstitching by a lot, knowing that you do that to compensate for the fact that it narrows up. So it's making it bolder, making it wider, those sorts of things when you go up on your pull offset. All right, I put 1 point on pretty much everything I do, 1 to 2 points. If you find yourself wanting to go over 3 points, maybe make other changes to your design rather than keep on using offset to fix it. So all that's doing is it's making it bolder, it's making it wider. Now, in the same vein, if you look at a shape, and this is why I avoid doing pull by percent. So let's say I say make it 150%. It adds distortions. You see that? No longer do I have a triangle. And why is that? It's again because the distance from it's multiplication based. So it's going, all right, overstitch by 50%. Cool. Well, the distance from here to there, 50% is a small number. By the time I get down here, 50% if I were to measure it from here to there, is a lot bigger. So it's going to overstitch more on your wide areas. It's going to overstitch less on your thin areas. Okay, it can add distortions. So on script fonts, I've had clients call and say, hey, I've changed I want it to stitch bolder, and I've changed my pull compensation to 170, and things are just looking weird now. Why is that? Because it's multiplication based. The thin points are barely getting any offset. Your thicker points of the font are getting a lot of offset, so it's distorting it. So those cases might be better for you to use an offset. So like I said, I don't use pull by percent. I just use offset. Do 1 to 3 points on everything. It makes it bolder, makes it wider. It compensates for the fact that things are narrowing up slightly. Okay. I hope that helps explain what it is. All right. We talked about those. Cool. How to get a font so small. All right. So that Ferris example, I posted a picture of this sew out. So the first sew out was this file as I originally opened it. So that was the one on the left of that. Go away. Stop it. On the left of my picture that I posted. So that was this guy. The one on the right, we made some changes to the kerning and the overlap on the lines, the connectors on this. I did the wireframe editing on the E, and that was this guy. Okay, it's subtle, but there's some changes. So there were some questions on, how do you do that? What did you do for these settings to make it work? All right, well, under properties, this is just a true type font, so nothing magic here. And it's kerned a little bit wider. That was specifically based on this design. Lower density because we're going to sew this with a 60 weight thread. 60 weight thread is thinner than a 40 weight thread. So if you keep all the settings identical to what you would use for a 40 weight thread, it's going to look sparse. It's going to look like it's not sewing enough. So you have to decrease your density so that you get more stitches along there. So I lowered it to, or David did, my friend, he did the original one. So to 3.1 and just did a basic underlay. This one's taller, so auto underlay, when it's small, it's going to default to a center walk. We could get a little bit better by changing this to just a center walk and decreasing the stitch length. For this first line of text, it didn't really matter, so auto's fine. But that is something to consider. Compensation, again, on the bigger text, quite a bit, because remember, things are going to narrow up, so you will compensate for that. And this is a true type font. This one, we did use the lettering compensation, which is fantastic for helping compensate for the fact that things sew in different directions, so that when it actually sews out, it'll be nice and even. Okay. And then making sure we have tie-in and tie-outs. There are different style tie-in and tie-outs. Style 1 is great for small things. The style 5, I know I've mentioned it before, is kind of my favorite. it does not work for small things because it's a big old X. So particularly when you get small, putting a big X on your on tiny letters, it kind of distracts. It looks like a period. It looks weird. So it doesn't really work. So staying to a style 1 and then minimizing your trims, because particularly when you're doing small stuff, you're barely moving from letter to letter. So avoiding trims whenever possible is a good thing to do. On this tiny text, this stuff down here was the same deal, same density. The underlay, like I said, changed the underlay to be something smaller. Also changed all the connection types to be bottom, because otherwise what I noticed on the first stitch out is it looked kind of muddy because the connectors were in the middle, making it harder to see the individual letters. So changing it to a bottom connect, I liked that better, except then I wanted bottom connect on the E, looked silly, so I moved to that one manually by changing your starts and stops. So, and this is also where I did the wireframe editing to kind of open up that hole and lower this to get it away from looking like a dot. All right, so you'll notice there's nothing really big here. If I pull up some of these other designs, yeah, like this one. Okay, so this one is another one. It sews out beautifully, and if you notice, it is, you know, this is manually punched, or it was punched using lettering and then converted to manual, or converted to wireframe, so you could do that. But it's all just working with the different settings. So if I look at these, again, a density of 3.1 for a 60 weight thread. This one, because it's all manually punched underlay, that you don't have underlay on all your elements. All right. You can also do just wording, right? So here, did I really not bring that one over? Doesn't look like I did. All right, I'll open this one. It's an excerpt from The Wizard of Oz, I think. Yeah, so this one was designed for 75 weight thread. Again, 75 weight is even smaller, right, than a 60 weight thread. So again, you have to decrease your density. You have to have a center walk underlay, and yeah, this is literally just a standard font with height of there. Under your top stitching, your density comes down. Your underlay, again, is a small center walk underlay. We've got a few points of offset for compensation. I would actually turn that on too. And then again, your style 1 tie-offs. And that's really all there is to it, you know, and then sew it out and go for it. That was done in B10. Okay, so there is a really nice video that Scott did a while back on tiny lettering. Check that out. It's great. He talks a lot about it, and kind of the whys behind, you know, minimizing your connections, how you have to manually punch the underlay and why, things like that. So it's a really good video. I'd highly recommend watching that. See if we can get you a link. Question we have is best way to make patches. So I think we've got a bunch of videos that we can link you to, but I'll show you. Best is subjective, right? I'll show you how I like to make them. All right, so when I make patches, it really depends on how you're going to deal with the fabric. If you're going to pre-cut them, pre-cut the fabric into circles or whatever your shape is, or if you're going to cut in place in the hoop, how you set up the digitizing file is done a little bit different, right? So if I do a walk, I'm going to do an automatic circle, draw a circle. Let's say I want that to be 3 inches, so I'm just going to change this to 3 inches and center it up. All right, so I've got a circle. All right, so normally what I would do is run that just to get me a placement. I would go grab a hunk of fabric. Oh, these are cute. All right, so let's say we're making something like that. So I go grab the fabric and lay it down on top of this. So then I would need copy and paste. I need a color change. There we go. So I've got my walk, I've got my placement. So now I've got, if I just go grab my fabric, so I'm gonna pretend this is a piece of fabric. Okay. Oh, all right. So placement, I lay my fabric down. Now I sew this. So now I've got a rectangle sewed to my plate, to my hoop. All right, now what do we do? Now we go grab our scissors. These scissors are pretty cool. the double curved, because you can get around the hoop. So I tend to use these sorts of scissors and cut relatively close to that. So now rather than having that, I have a circle. Usually it's a little bit bigger than what the line was. All right, so now I've got a circle kind of zigzag cut down there. All right, so then what do? So we take this guy, again, I'm going to copy and paste it and give it a new color. And I want to change its type from a bean to a tackle. So a tackle is just a single line center column. So I can hold my control key down on that bean stitch and click control on the keyboard. Click that, makes it a satin stitch, change it to tackle. And maybe we want that to be like 30 points. Okay, so that's a zigzag to now hold that fabric down in place. So now you would, digitize whatever you want to go on here. If it's going to be text, a design, whatever, you'd sew it on. And from here, now you've got to decide what sort of border do you want. So again, I can copy and paste that, change it to a satin stitch, make it closer to 40. And if I want a satin look, we can do that. If you want that instead of a satin, you want it to be a decorative, where's the, there, good grief, sorry. My eyes were not zooming on that, so that is not the right way to do that. Let's try that again. Copy, paste, move that down here. And now change it to a decorative foam arrow. And we want it the other way, so I'm going to change it to a foam arrow one. There we go. So now I can move this guy in a little bit and we will have a foam arrow instead. Okay. What are the name of these scissors? These are double curved scissors. You can get them from a bunch of places. This particular brand is Havel, but Ginger makes them. You can find them. It's just double curved scissors. They're fun. I like them because they reach around the hoop and I'm not fighting with them that way. Okay. So when you set this up on your machine, it's just applique stops. And that's how I do patches anyway. You just decide how you want them to look. All right, what other questions? All right, did I cover all of this? Yes. All right, any other questions that you guys wanted me to cover before we call it a day? I don't know about y'all. Christmas season is kicking my butt. Go, go, go in the shop. That's all it is. All right. I don't see any other questions being typed in right yet. Ah, there we go. What would be the best fabric to stitch onto? Things to think about with fabric for patches. So if you use a synthetic material, if you have fabric that's sticking out the edges. Let's see. Sorry, I have patches on the floor. Yeah, this one is... Nope. I was looking to see if I had an example near here. All right. Oh, stabilizer. 6mm plastic works great. You can use Badge Master, or you can go... I've seen people use sandwich bags. I wouldn't suggest that. I've seen it. It's interesting. I've seen people use plastic bags from the grocery store. Again, I've done that in a pinch in a training. Again, probably not the best idea, but it works. The best, you can use a 12 gauge vinyl. You know the stuff that you'll see covering tables at like little diners? They'll put that kind of clear plastic over it. That's a vinyl. So you can get a clear vinyl and use that as a stabilizer. My favorite though is to use a 6mm plastic. You can get it at any of the hardware stores, Lowe's, Home Depot. It's basically the plastic drop cloth. The thin one, not so much. The thick one works nicely. So you do that. You'd sew out. Then you can use whatever fabric you want. I would suggest using a heavier weight fabric. Twill works great. If you make sure it's synthetic, So if it's polyester of some sort or some synthetic material, that makes it where if you have, you know, if you're cutting in the hoop and you don't quite cut as close as you should, you can take a hot knife and burn the edges, and it will kind of clean it up real nice. So that's a nice thing to consider. Whereas if you use cottons or things like that, you're not going to burn it clean. So using a synthetic will help with that. Trying to think any other tips. Once you poke it out of the plastic, if you're not using a water-soluble stabilizer like a Vilene or the Badge Master, then you can grab a heat gun and blow it around the edges, and that will melt all the little pokies. I know I say pokies a lot, but it melts the little plastic that's hanging out. Okay. Yeah. What other questions? Anything? If not, I guess I will call it a day. I think we've got one more week before the holiday season. I'm going to be flying out of town on the 25th to go skiing, so we'll have a brief break and start back in the new year, but I'll be back next week for sure for another Q&A for y'all. So I hope these are helpful for you. If you have questions, you can always send them to applications@melco.com. You can type them in on these threads live. As you noticed, I tend to try to keep an eye on them to see what we can get answered for you real time. And we did get a link posted to the application team tutorial on patches, so you can kind of see another technique on that. All right. Well, you guys have a fantastic weekend, and I will be back next week. All right. Till next time. Bye.